Hi there, folks. We have a couple more minutes before we get started right at 6 p.m. But for now, just wanted to let you know that we're here hanging out on the line. Looking forward to this webinar with you all. We'll be right back in about 3 minutes. Thank you. All righty, I have 6 o'clock, so I will go ahead and get us started. Welcome everyone to the second webinar in our Healthy Soils Program webinar series. 2 weeks back, if you joined us or watched the recording, we discussed how to make compost on your farm, branch, orchard as part of the Healthy Soils Program, or if you're just interested in learning how. And today we'll be diving more into why compost is so great and how you can use and apply it in a bunch of great ways on your agricultural property with a fantastic expert who I'll introduce in just a moment. This webinar, titled Compost, a Misunderstood and Underutilized Natural Resource for Creating Healthy Soils, Food, Water, and Air Quality, all those great things and more, is done in partnership with San Pasqual Valley Soils. Dr. Craig will be joining us in just a moment, and it is sponsored by the California Department of Food and Agriculture, who runs the Healthy Soils Program, and California Climate Investments, which helps use cap and trade dollars to fund a wide array of climate change altering programs. So I'll go ahead and get us rolling. My name is Kelsey. I'm here from Solana Center. If you haven't joined us in one of these webinars or another Solana Center webinar before, a quick intro to us. We are a nonprofit organization located in San Diego County, but we do work throughout our region and throughout California through the Healthy Soils Program. We are focused on soil, waste, water, and compost helps bring all of those things together, as we will discuss today. So as I mentioned, I'm Kelsey. I'm an environmental education specialist here at Solana Center, and I help head up our Healthy Soils Program. Diane Hazard, our Director of Education, who's been involved through Healthy Soils Program throughout the years, is on the line as well. She'll be popping in at different points throughout the webinar to join as well. So that's our team here on this end. And then I will be introducing in a moment Dr. Craig Kolodji, and he is joining us from San Pasqual Valley Soils, which is also here in the San Diego area. They're located in Escondido, but I love talking about San Pasqual Valley Soils and their sister company, Frank Conine Dairy, because what they do is super cool. So starting at Frank Conine Dairy, they are one of the only remaining dairies here in San Diego County. They have about 880 milking cows, and they have a really awesome model for turning local organic waste into animal feed to help keep their cows happy and milking. So they take all sorts of food scraps, fruits and fruit pulp, vegetables, discarded bakery materials from food production throughout our region, more than 1,000 tons of material each month, and they turn it into feed for their animals instead of landfilling it. So it's now feeding cows and supporting a local family-owned business instead of going to the landfills, which is super cool. And then very intimately connected to what Frank Conine Dairy does is San Pasqual Valley Soils, which takes the manure from those cattle as well as different agricultural and landscaping residues from throughout the county, and they turn it into an array of beautiful compost and soil amendments right next to the dairy. You can see a couple pictures of their cows, of their dairy area, and then the composting facility is there right at the base of the dairy, which is so cool. They're one of, if not the only OMRI organic certified compost facilities here in San Diego County. And they have this really just amazing 13-acre composting facility in Escondido that they use to help divert over 14,000 tons of green waste from local landfills each year. So at this point, I'll go ahead and introduce the man that helps make it all happen, which is Dr. Craig Kolodji. You can see his extensive list of qualifications here. Craig, did you want to say any more about yourself besides, all of your great experience and the wonderful things you're doing now before we get started with the webinar?
No, actually, you've done a nice job. That's quite a mouthful right there on the screen, as you can see. I am a native Minnesotan. I grew up in Minnesota, but in high school, my family moved to California, and I'm a hardcore Southern Californian today, and I just love the state, and I love the agriculture in the state, and I'm really looking forward to sharing with everyone some of my background and experiences in the area of compost utilization.
Beautiful. Then we'll be hearing plenty from Dr. Craig in just a moment. But as you can see, he has extensive experience helping to support agriculture and especially the use of compost as a way to improve our agricultural soils, our air and our water, building off of many decades of experience. So you'll get to see just how much he knows in just a few minutes. So some of you joining us tonight may be here as Healthy Soils Program applicants. I've seen some technical assistance providers joining us previously as well. But if this is your first time hearing about the program, I'd love to introduce you to HSP, as we commonly call it as well. So HSP is a program that is facilitated by California Department of Food and Agriculture, and really at the core of it is helping to keep carbon out of our atmosphere and therefore causing global warming by putting it into our soils. So they help fund a wide array of practices and offer money to farmers for them to put forth these soil building practices on their agricultural properties, whether it be applying compost, which we'll be talking about extensively today, planting perennials, adding mulch, no-till and low-till practices. The Healthy Soils program helps provide a means for it to be a little bit easier on farmers financially to be able to build soils and store carbon in their soils instead of the atmosphere. They just closed out the application period last week. So last time we were doing this, I was saying, if you're interested in applying, reach out to us and we'll help make it happen. They've just closed for now, but hopefully in the next year or so, we'll see it opening back up again. So I highly encourage and believe in the Healthy Soils program. If you have an agricultural property and are looking to make it more sustainable and reap the benefits of healthy soil in the process, as we'll be talking about today. So with that, we have our outline for today. Dr. Craig is going to be talking us through a better understanding of what compost is, as far as the ingredients that go into it, what the final product is made of, as well as dispelling a few myths about compost, discussing different ways to apply it, and the many different uses for compost. A lot of people come in with the misconception of you just mix it in with the soil, which is one way to go. Dr. Craig is going to talk about how you can, really reap the full benefit of compost in a few ways throughout our webinar, and we'll wrap up with understanding how to be a practitioner of healthy soil and why it is so important for all of us, and being able to continue to feed ourselves and support life here on this planet. So with that, I think that I have gone through my intro. Dr. Craig, I am going to let you take the stage. Diane.
Sorry, Kelsey, if I missed this because I'm multitasking, but
Yeah, no worries.
did you make sure you told people that where they can put their question, how they can do the questions, that we'll have several question breaks, but we'll also stay on afterwards if need be to address any questions that didn't get addressed.
Thank you. Yes, I did send a little summary in the chat, but yeah, just building off what Diane said, if you have questions, please send them in through the Q&A option in Zoom. It helps us keep track of questions, which can sometimes get lost if you send them in the chat. And we will be stopping for a few question breaks throughout. We may hold on some questions till the very end, but we're happy to stay on and make sure that they all get answered. I'll also be setting a few links in the chat throughout the webinar. If you miss any of them, no worries. I will also be sending up a follow-up email with a resource document of all the links that were sent out today and possibly even more. So fear not, go ahead and focus on the information being shared with you right now, and we will help make sure that you have access to everything later. This webinar is being recorded and that follow-up email will have a link. So if you miss anything, don't worry, we got you covered. All right, thank you, Diane, for helping me take care of business. And once again, I'll hand off to you, Dr. Craig, to carry us away into the wonderful world of healthy soil and compost.
Well, thank you, Kelsey, and welcome everybody. I'd kind of like to start off by one of my favorite writers, Mark Twain, and a quote he gave that I kind of sums up, at least for me, my whole evolution into the world of compost and understanding its value in that. And he once said, "It ain't what you don't know that gets you into trouble. It's what you know for sure that just ain't so." And I think that's true of all of us in that there's so many things that we assume we know, and it kind of closes that window to allow us to be more open to understanding things in a little different way. And I think compost is one of those topics. So what my objective today is to really take a look at what we mean when we talk about healthy soils, when we talk about soil organic matter and the life in the soil, why it's important, why it's so critical to our very survival on this planet. Then talk about some of the myths or misunderstandings, if you will, associated with compost that oftentimes can get us into trouble because we think we know. And then I'll go into some applications and ways of using compost that you may not have realized how unbelievably useful this product that we call compost is in all of its various forms. And then we'll end, and I'll just wrap it up with a summary of just how working with compost truly is a way of getting involved in caring for this planet and becoming stewards and what I like to call practitioners of healthy soil. So healthy soil, then, when we talk about it, it is that material that allows plants to grow to their maximum productivity without disease or pests and without a need for off-farm supplements. Now that's in an ideal world. Typically, when we think of a healthy soil, it'll typically be a balance of 25% air, 25% water, about 45% minerals, and 5% organic matter. And that 5% is very, very important. We're going to be zeroing in on that a bit. But notice that the organic matter impacts everything above it, the minerals, the water, the way they aggregate, the water holding capacity, and the aeration of the soil. So all of this is impacted by that small 5% on the bottom. Next slide. So organic materials basically is anything that was once alive. Okay, and it always contains carbon. So a lot of times when people think of organic, they think of carbon, but it also contains various amounts of all these other elements that are not carbon-based, but are attached to that carbon or related to it in some way. Nitrogen, phosphorus, oxygen, hydrogen, sulfur, potassium, magnesium, copper chloride, etc. A lot of minor elements. There are a lot of things going on with organic material that we can benefit from if we just understand how to work with it. Next slide. So nature works through cycling. It's dynamic, it's constantly moving, and carbon cycle is the one I put on the top because it's been the one that I think got us into the issue of climate change and why where we're at right today. That carbon cycle wasn't paid enough attention on how critical it is to our very survival and to the climate change that's occurring on this planet in a global way. But you also have nitrogen cycles going on, water cycles, hydrologic cycles, they'll call them, phosphorus cycles, nutrient cycling, all happening all simultaneously, all at once. It's a very dynamic, moving thing that affects our air, water, and soil quality. Next slide. So organic matter, we talk about that, and it is the foundation of healthy soils, but what are we actually talking about? Well, soil organic matter is that fraction of soil that consists of the plant and or animal tissue in various stages of breakdown, or what they term decomposition, being broken down into its various parts. Most of our productive agricultural soils have been, I got a pop-up slide that's covering this, so there we go. Most of our productive agricultural soils have been between 3 to 6% organic matter, not a lot. But if I say productive, I would say the vast majority of soils in our state probably have less than 1% on average. Does that mean they're not productive? No, we make up for that productivity with a lot of synthetic inputs. But we're gonna talk about how we can work with nature to take advantage of what this organic matter will give us. Next slide. So with careful management and preservation and the accumulation of soil organic matter, you can help improve that soil productivity by impacting the air quality, the water quality, the minerals, and availability of those minerals, and the organic material in itself. And it results in greater farm profitability if we do it correctly and we understand what we're doing. That's why it's so important to educate ourselves. You protect and improve not only the soil, but even equally important, the quality of our own water and our air quality. Next. So organic matter sources, typically there are a number of different sources. Compost is the one we're going to be focusing on today, and we'll define what that is. Crop residues, animal manures are all sources of organic matter. They may all go into the production of compost as a feedstock. Cover crops are one that's part of the conservation practices with the CDFA program. Perennial grasses and legumes, alfalfa, what have you. One of the quickest ways to increase organic matter is with a high carbon material such as compost and semi-solid manures. Next slide. So what is it? Soil-like material, the remains of these decomposed diverse organic raw materials, or feedstocks is another term professional composters use. So a good compost is going to be aerobic, at least in the end. It's not entirely aerobic. There are pockets within a compost pile that don't get a lot of oxygen, but by and large, it's an aerobic process, and it's one you want to manage that oxygen in your compost piles and commercially. It's alive, it's rich in organic matter and the organisms that feed off that material. It's stable, meaning it's not changing on us quickly. It's slowly changing over time. And it's weed and pathogen free. We do not want to be introducing weeds or pathogens into our soil and our production systems with a incomplete or improperly produced material like compost. And it's variable. It includes and is specially made with many different feedstocks. Next slide. So what's in it? Well, it's the habitat for bacteria, fungi, protozoas. And next slide, we call that the soil food web. So in that soil and in that compost, you have a myriad of organisms. Now they're showing more than just microscopic. Most of the material, the life that you find in the soil is going to be microscopic bacteria, fungi, and actinomycetes. Next slide. So let's take a look at these microorganisms and what I like to term livestock. And I'll tell you why in just a second. They do most of the work for you. Next slide. There's going to be a bunch. So you got the bacteria. Next. You got the fungi. These are the big ones. These are the hard workers. These are your crew. And next. And you got the thing that gives soil its smell. When you think of soil and you say it smells earthy, what you're really smelling is the life in the soil. It's the actinobacteria. If I take and I literally bake soil and kill all this life, you will not pick up any odor that you would even associate with actual soil. So it's these organisms that predominate the compost organic matter. Next slide. And to give you an idea of just how many there are of these microbes, 1 cup of healthy soil, 1 cup contains 200 billion bacteria, 20 million protozoa, about 60 plus miles of fungal filamentous hyphae, nematodes, which are these roundworms, both parasitic but mostly beneficial, roundworms that are microscopic, 100,000 in a good cup of healthy soil, and arthropods somewhere around 50,000. Now that's quite a colony of life in that 1 cup, isn't it? Next slide. And these microorganisms are eating organic material and turning it into organic matter or soil carbon. They derive their nutrients and energy from this organic material, and they create compost in the process and become literally part of the compost. So the compost doesn't just include organic matter, it includes all the microbes that are living off of this organic matter. And they tend to eat, in fact, they do eat on the surface. Next slide. So when we get down to a microscopic level, the particle size and surface area makes a big difference. So you have these organisms working from the surface inward. Next slide. The particle size and surface area is really critical when it comes to the decomposition of organic matter. The smaller the particles they have more surface area than larger particles of equal volume, so they decompose faster. So if you're trying to accelerate what nature is trying to do in decomposing organic matter, the more surface area you have to work with, the smaller the particle size, the faster that process becomes. Next. There you go. Smaller organic particles, more organic carbon is then released into the soil and into the microbes that feed upon it. Compost equals food for the microbial livestock. Every acre of healthy soil supports enough organisms. This is just to put it in proper perspective to match the weight of an average sized cow, which is approximately 1,600 pounds, just under a ton. In addition to feeding your crop, you must also include feeding your soil livestock. I learned that from Neil Kinsey, a student of William Albrecht, head of the Department of Soils in Missouri many, many years ago. Very big proponent of healthy soils and living soils. And Neil Kinsey is a consultant. And when he put it this way, I really grasped it, considering that I was working with and on a dairy farm here in San Pasqual. Next slide. And this livestock acts as a soil conditioner first and foremost. So when people talk about compost, think about that organic matter, the slow release of the nutrients, the micronutrients, and the water holding capacity and nutrient holding capacity of that material. Next. It also is a source of organisms, and these organisms can actually be suppressive to pathogenic organisms. So there's a battle going on there. So they feed that, and that can lead to better plant health. It can also increase nutrient release, earthworms, and then, as I mentioned, disease suppression. Next. And then you have mulch. Compost, and we're going to cover this under myths, is a very, very important and critical mulch application that can be used for erosion protection. And we're going to talk about that in more detail. Moisture conservation, why the finer the material, the better. Weed suppression and temperature regulation of the soil. Next. So the benefits of compost use in the soil are physical, chemical, and biological. Next, physical improves that soil structure, moisture management. It holds a lot of water. 1 cubic foot of a fine compost will hold 4 gallons of water in that soil. That's a lot of water holding capacity. Adds organic matter and soil carbon to feed those microbes. Chemically, it modifies and stabilizes the pH. Organic matter tends to move everything more towards a neutral pH or even slightly acidic, depending on what the feedstocks are. It reduces aluminum, manganese, and iron toxicity in acid soils. We don't have that problem out here. Increases cation exchange capacity, meaning it holds nutrients and other valuable elements that the plant needs and requires, and it supplies these nutrients in a very slow release manner. It is biological. It binds and degrades contaminants. It can actually decompose hydrocarbons, for example. These microbes will actually eat oil, diesel, and other hydrocarbons like gasoline as a food source and degrade them and make them non-toxic to our environment. Nutrient cycling, as I mentioned earlier, supplies soil biota, the soil life, these microbes, this livestock, and suppresses plant diseases. Next. So we've covered all this, got all these great benefits, but let's start looking at some of the misperceptions. Compost has a broad appeal because of its simplicity and versatility. This also makes compost materials prone to common misperceptions and myths. If you will, old wives' tales, we used to call them. The art of using compost combines both the scientific knowledge with the grower's experience, judgment, and intuition and ethics. So let's take a look now at some of these, what I call compost myths. Next. All composts are basically the same and possess similar characteristics and qualities. That's a common perception, believe it or not. Everyone's compost is compost. Well, actually, the fact is that compost encompasses a variety of products of different types that with different characteristics that vary with the feedstocks. It also varies with the particle size and the composting methods and how the compost was produced and processed and how long they are processed. How long did it cure? Bottom line, not all composts are created equal. Next. So if that's a fact, then how do we know what we got? How do we know what we're working with and whether it can do what we're hoping it'll do for us? Well, there are tests that can be done, and one of them is a program by the U.S. Composting Council. I'm a member of the board of directors for the Association of Compost Producers in California, which is the U.S. Composting branch here in the state. And the U.S. Composting Council established a program called the Seal of Testing Assurance, STA. The Seal of Testing Assurance says that you're going to test that compost using very standard specified techniques, methodologies. It's called TMEC, the testing methodology, the testing method for the evaluation of compost and composting. And they're going to tell you what's in it. They're not going to tell you whether it's going to be good for you, what you're trying to do with it, but you'll know what you have and what the characteristics are. It's up to you to determine what you want to do with that material and what you want to do with that information. There's also the OMRI certification, which is the Organic Materials Review Institute. And that is also a very well-known for organic production, particularly well-known organization that requires a certain amount of test results and literally certifies and backs up the fact that that material has been produced a certain way and has a certain quality to it. There's also and I didn't include it on here, but I should have, the CDFA Organic Input Materials Program. All of these programs give you insight into what you're dealing with so that you know what you have to work with. Next. This is what these test results look like. They're explained on the back. They do a nice job, but you can always talk to the lab that you are working with and they will walk you through the interpretation of all of the data, the heavy metals that are in there. And so I'm not going to go into it other than that it's an extremely thorough, very well-developed program that assures you and gives you that confidence that the material you're using, you know what's in it, you know how it behaves in terms of seed germination, whether it's mature, how stable it is, all of these qualities that make for a good material. Next. So organic carbon, one of the key components of all compost. Is organic carbon just carbon? Well, actually, it's always associated with other things. Carbon has this amazing molecule of all living structure on this planet that has the affinity to attach all kinds of things to it. So you have sugars, hydrocarbons, starches that are all containing carbon, proteins and fats contain carbon, cellulose from trees and vegetation, the hemicellulose, the chitin, lignin and the lignocellulose, which provides that structure and that resistance to our woody material. All of these contain organic carbon. Next. Most organic substances come from food, manures, vegetation, and wood and paper. Next. The nitrogen component of compost is going to come from the associated amino acids, the proteins. Proteins have a large amount of nitrogen associated with them. And the sources for the nitrogen will typically come from the fresh plant tissue, what we call the greens, grass clipping, green leaves, fruits and vegetables, and animal waste, manures, meats, feather, hair, blood, etc. Next. Now we're going to move into that relationship. So we talked about carbon, where you find it. We talked about nitrogen, where it comes from. Now the ratio of the total mass of carbon to total mass of nitrogen is called the carbon-nitrogen ratio. And why is that important? Well, the ideal ratio for a finished compost is between 11:1 and 20:1. 11:1 is going to be on the higher nitrogen, lower carbon side. The 20:1 is going to be on the higher carbon, lower nitrogen ratio. It reflects the overall balance of these two essential elements. It does not account for degradability, the bulk density of your material, or other key parameters. Next. So why is it important then? For general agricultural use, it is desirable if you have a C to N ratio of carbon to nitrogen in the compost to be less than 20:1 and greater than 11:1. Using a compost with a carbon to nitrogen ratio greater than 20:1 can lead to nitrogen immobilization. It'll tie up the availability of and the access to the nitrogen by the plant root system. An 11:1 carbon to nitrogen ratio lower than 11 can actually feed microbes that will start to feed on the stored carbon in the soil environment and decrease that carbon and humus stored in the soil. So that range between 11:1 and 21 is the sweet spot, and your compost will vary depending on the feedstocks, either more on the nitrogen side or more on the carbon side. And it'll always be a report, it'll be a carbon nitrogen ratio report on your soil analysis or your compost analysis. It'll always be featured on that because it's such a critical parameter to measure and watch. Next. So the higher the carbon and nitrogen of the compost, the greater the potential for storing carbon when applied to soil. So the Healthy Soil Program therefore allows for a greater quantity of compost with a higher carbon content, 20:1, to be applied 6 to 8 tons per acre. Then the lower C to N ratio compost with more nitrogen, less carbon, where they like to allow you to only apply 3 to 5 tons. Because keep in mind, the CDFA program is designed not only to increase the life in the soil, but to sequester more carbon and move it from the air back into the soil to address global warming and climate change. This incentivizes the grower to use the higher carbon nitrogen ratio compost to increase carbon sequestration or storage in the soil. Simply put, all of you, when you filled out your application for the Healthy Soils Program, had to decide which one of these types of compost you were going to use. And you were incentivized and awarded certain funds based on which one you selected. Next. We're going to stop here and allow you to ask any questions. So I'll turn it over to Kelsey.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for for leading the way so far, Dr. Craig. I'm gonna go ahead and check out our questions. Oh, okay. So one question that we had come in was, you had discussed before, Dr. Craig, the composition of soil in terms of, your air, water, mineral, organic matter content. And you said that the organic matter is around 5%. Of course, it varies based on where you are, but is there any additional benefit to having soil organic matter that's even higher than 5%?
There is some, but after a while, it'll actually start to stabilize out. You can only add so much material to soil. In fact, if you get too much carbon in there, as I said, you can actually tie up your nitrogen availability. So there's a fine line. Like I said, anywhere, an ideal productive soil is going to be anywhere from 3 to 6% in that range. We have some pastures here at the dairy where we've been applying truthfully cow manure for years on these pastures. And we've got a carbon nitrogen ratio after years of constant application of 6.5% carbon, organic matter and carbon in that soil. And obviously the cows benefit from it and the quality of the pasture benefits from it. So there is a limit. The other thing, there was a limit on the grant, the Healthy Soils Program grant, because they couldn't allow people to apply massive amounts because there was only limited funding to support the application of compost. So they had a very difficult balancing act of making sure that they allowed people to apply enough compost to make a difference, but not so much that they ran out of funding and weren't able to share it with as many people.
Gotcha. Definitely very good insight. And I know that there are also limits with the Healthy Soils Program on what your starting soil organic matter can be if you're going to be applying for compost. I think that it might, I'm trying to remember off the top of my head. I can double check the RGA while you continue talking, but I think it's like 15% organic matter, and you're thinking, why do they actually have 15% greater? But I will verify that I am remembering that correctly. Diane, I saw that you came on. Did you have something that you wanted to add?
I have a couple questions, but you know what? I'm looking at the time, so I'm going to hold on to them and I will save them to the end. So I was just waiting to see where we're going with this, but I have some of my own questions. I'm going to hold to the end. Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that folks' questions are coming in. I think that we're going to take one more right now, and then we'll continue on just for the sake of time. Once again, any outstanding questions we'll make sure get addressed before we hop off for the night. One other question we had come in, how can I tell bad compost from good on my farm without any of the MRI or SDA testing? Things like smells, touch, what do you recommend, Dr. Craig?
Well, that's where you can do a germinate, take your compost, and we're going to talk about this later in the presentation. But one of the tests that labs actually do is they take cucumber seeds and they blend the compost that you've sent them in with some, I believe it's vermiculite is the technology they use, but you could take your own native soil and add the compost that you produced and then plant some seed into it in a small pot before you just go ahead and broadcast it, and observe the emergence, percent emergence, what seed germinated in that amended soil that you use your compost in, and then also the vigor of the seedling. And you can do it with whatever plants you were going to grow in there, but it's a little bit of a pilot, kind of what they call a bioassay. You're using biology to assess the quality of your compost and what you're going to be using the compost for, which is in most cases growing plants. And so depending on what plants you're growing, you can do your own little on-farm test and determine before you go ahead and apply it to all your soils to make sure that it's truly going to perform the way you hope it will.
Absolutely. And I know that smell and especially like the texture and the appearance can help give you some hints, but it's definitely good to follow up with with a test such as you described. And I know you have a slide on it later on as well, just to verify that even if it is looking like good finished compost, it's actually ready to help serve your plants and help them meet their maximum potential. Alrighty, I know we have a few more questions. We'll hold on to those for now. And Dr. Craig, I'll let you carry us away once more.
All right, next. So here's another one. Compost is not mulch and mulch is not compost. In fact, in the CDFA grant, they talk about compost and they talk about mulch as if they're two separate products altogether, while in fact compost, depending on what you're trying to accomplish, can be used as a plant growing media, a native soil amendment, and or a mulch. And mulch by definition is simply any material, inorganic or organic, that protects the soil surface and allows air and water through. It can be composted material with fine, medium, and coarse particles, or it can be non-composted wood chips, bark, colored ground hardwood. I've seen rock compost, newspapers, cardboard. I think you get the picture. It's anything that you apply to soil. It's a very broadly defined term in this case. Next. So here's an example of fine compost, not coarse. This is 1/2 inch minus. This material came from our facility, and it was used actually in our neighborhood as a slope erosion control mulch. And also because it was fine, it also was able to feed the existing ground cover that they planted on that slope to hold that soil in. It's a beautiful example of how fine compost can be used as a mulch, not only to eliminate and minimize soil movement or erosion off that slope, but also to continue to feed the vegetation that you plant on the slope. Next. So compost, when used as a mulch layer on bare soil to prevent water and wind erosion and conserve water and minimize weeds, should be a coarse mulch with a particle size of 2 to 3 inches. We often think of mulch as this coarse material. In fact, that's why people get confused. They think, well, if I'm going to be a mulch, it's got to be coarse and it's got to be kind of woody and chunky. Well, compost, when used actually as a mulch for stormwater erosion control, is typically a fine to medium material, 1/2 inch to 1 inch or less in size. And it's applied at a depth typically no greater than 2 inches. So, and we're going to show a slide of why that is, but on slopes, you can actually add the coarser material, larger particle size compost, 2 to 3 inches to the fine compost to help actually secure it on steeper slopes, 2 to 1 slopes or what have you. Usually you'll blend the coarse material, let's say at 20 to 30% to 70 to 80% of the fine material. And then that larger particle material lays on top of the root system while the finer material filters down and becomes available to feed the roots and also hold more water. It's actually like a layered blanket of coarse on fine. That's on a slope situation. On level ground, typically all you need is the fine material and it'll do a fabulous job. Usually typically no more than 2 inches. Next. So this fine material is oftentimes referred to as a composted growing media. We usually buy it to amend our soils, to grow plants in. But because it is such a fine material, it has a lot of surface area, and therefore it's designed to hold a lot of water. So it absorbs the water and it supports the plant growth. That water absorbing quality of a fine compost mulch reduces the amount of stormwater volume on the slope, preventing that soil from moving. If you have no runoff because the composted mulch has absorbed your water from a rain event, do you have an erosion problem? Do you have a runoff problem? No. It's called volume control, and the volume control with compost is associated with the finer material, not necessarily the coarse. The coarse you can use, it just won't hold as much water, and it certainly won't provide as much nutrients for the plant growth. Next. So here's an actual example of this 1/2 inch minus material blown on a slope, and they call it a compost erosion control blanket. Next. And ideally, well, here's why compost erosion control blankets use fine compost over coarse. It's all about that increased water absorption and support for vegetative establishment. Here is an example of seed that's been applied with the fine compost to vegetate that slope and hold that soil in place. Next. Why compost bankers use it? Take a look at that slide and look at all the contact of that fine compost with that soil surface. Every nook and cranny is filled with the fine material, thereby locking in that soil surface so it's not going to move when the rain comes, absorbing that water, and obviously providing a tremendous amount of nutrients and biology for optimum root growth. Next. Here's another one. Compost is 100% organic. Well, we already talked and defined what organic meant. Just means it comes from something that was once alive, right? Well, things that are alive aren't just, organic, meaning they contain minerals. Compost products contain substantial amount of non-organic minerals and or inert components, sometimes actually in proportions exceeding that of organic fraction. When we scrape the manure pins to get the manure, we're also picking up a lot of mineral with that. And so our Valley's Best cow manure compost actually has a fair amount of minerals as well as organic material present in it, and they work very well together. Next. Here's another big one. Compost is a fertilizer. Well, yes and no, depending on how you define fertilizer, I guess. But compared to conventional fertilizers, the plant nutrients in compost are relatively low, especially nitrogen, and they vary in their concentrations and availability depending on the feedstock. Animal manure type compost will have higher nitrogen levels, are maybe about 1 to 4% nitrogen. The landscape compost without the animal manures oftentimes will be under 1%, 0.5% of nitrogen, very low. So immediate fertilizer value is typically low. Think of a slow release over years, not months, of the nutrients that are locked in that material. If you have a high nitrogen compost with, let's say, 11 to 1 or lower, you're going to find about 10% of that is made available on average the first year. The second year, in year 2, let's say, of your grant, you're going to have 5%. In year 3, 2.5%. It goes, and then after 3 years, it'll be about 2% of the immediate nitrogen in that compost will be made available. If you have a landscape compost high in carbon, over 11 to 1, up towards 20 to 1, you're going to have only 5% nitrogen available that first year, 2.5% the second year, and then in year 3 and thereafter, 2% of that nitrogen will be made available. That's based on the research. So you can see it's a very slow way to get your nutrients. Remember, we talked about compost as being a soil conditioner and a nutrient recycler because of its cation exchange capacity and everything else associated with it and that biological life. But typically, if you're going to use compost, you really have to pay attention to the amount of nitrogen your plants that you're going to grow in that are going to need, and you may have to supplement. In fact, in most cases, you will have to supplement unless you built up with a high nitrogen compost over many years. Next. Here's one. Compost is humus. You go online and you look up humus and they'll define it as compost. They actually are two different things. Compost and humus are not the same. Although compost contains humic compounds like humic acid and fulvic acid, they are not identical to soil humus. In fact, soil humus is a very controversial subject right now. There are some scientists, in fact, they say the majority of soil scientists today say that soils don't truly hold long chain recalcitrant humus in the soil, that all organic matter in soil typically will break down over many, many years, some faster, some slower than others. It's a very, very hot topic. And it's a hot topic because we start talking about soil carbon being stored. If it's not being stored in humus, then how is it being stored? It's being stored in combination with the mineral fractions in the soil, with aggregation, and with ways we're still discovering. It's a very, very active area of soil science right now, and that is how does carbon in the soil carbon compost that then breaks down this soil carbon, how does it sustain itself in soils over time? A lot of it has to do with that life in the soil, and it has to do with the aggregates and the mineral fraction from what I've been reading recently. Next. So curing. When and for how long and why should you cure compost? Well, we've got typically compost goes through a number of phases. We're not going to get into the composting process tonight, other than know that it goes through a thermophilic phase, which is temperatures above 131 degrees, and typically between 131 and 160, ideally about 140, 145. And then it goes into a mesophilic, actually starts off mesophilic. The bacteria start to activate, they raise that temperature, that now the thermophiles take over, and then they actively consume that carbon and that nitrogen, and then they will start to die off, and it'll start to cool, the pile will start cooling off. When it starts cooling off, it's moving into a curing phase, a mesophilic phase, where the temperatures are reduced from 131 to just sometimes around 100, 106, 111 degrees. During that curing phase, and you can cure a compost, the longer you cure it, the better. But that doesn't mean you can't use it before it's, in fact, we're going to talk about finished compost. But the longer you cure it, the more these microbes have an ability to get rid of various metabolites that occurred during the composting process and detoxify them, get rid of them. So your material becomes much more usable to the microbes that are going to feed upon it the longer you cure it. Next phase, next slide, I should say. So how much time are we talking about to get that material into a form that really the soil loves, the microbes, your livestock in the soil loves, and the plants love? Typically about 2 months to 2 years. 2 months is really on the short side, 2 years. But keep in mind, if you're going to use a material as a mulch, and it's just going to sit on the surface and provide you water conservation, weed control, soil temperature modification, do you need to have something that's been curing for 2 years? It would be great, but time is money for a lot of growers, and a 2-month period for a compost, as long as it's gone through the pathogen process for further reduction of pathogens, which is that thermophilic phase, as long as it's gone through that, after 2 months, you can typically use this material and it will continue to break down in the soil and continue to mature. And more typically, we're looking at 3 to 9 months for a good quality compost. It depends in, again, rough order of importance. How are you going to use it? Maturity, as I just mentioned, is not always required, particularly if you're going to use it as a mulch. Your feedstocks, what kind of feedstocks went into that compost? With our Valley's Best cow manure compost, minimum curing period of 3 months. Typically, we're at, by the time it's ready to be sold and people are purchasing, it's got closer to 6 months to 9 months of curing that have occurred with that. The landscape compost, a lot shorter. We can do that in a month to 2, 3 months, right in that range for our landscape materials. Management intensity, how you manage your compost will determine how mature it is and how stable it is. So you have to pay attention to your carbon nitrogen ratios, how many times you turn it, effectiveness of the aeration, the oxygen. You do not want your compost to go anaerobic, meaning too much water. Think of the moisture level as a really well run out sponge. That's the moisture level you want in your compost to get the amount of oxygen and still have those microbes active. And then temperature control. As I mentioned, these thermophiles can get temperatures so high that they can actually ignite a compost pile. You can actually get a compost fire because of the temperature if you pile it too high and don't turn it and don't understand the principles of compost processing. So that's unbelievable. It seems unbelievable that you could literally get a pile of compost to ignite, self-ignite, but that actually does happen when people stockpile even mature, what you would call mature compost, above 13 feet in height and with adequate moisture and nitrogen in there, it will self-ignite. Next. So curing, it eliminates these inhibitors to seed germination and crop growth. It really, I like to use the word, it mellows that organic material and makes it more valuable to you as a soil amendment and even as a mulch. Next. Temperature, when is the pile done? Well, we talked, it takes 2 to 3 months, maybe more, depending on your feedstocks and a number of other factors. Typically, a temperature of a pile, when it is less than 10% warmer than the ambient air temperature outside the pile, then that's a good kind of rule of thumb. About half to 1/3 of its original volume. So you're going to lose, in a pile of compost, we'll lose anywhere from 33 to 50% of our original volume. And that's going off as CO2 and nitrogen, and the microbes in that are breaking it down and compressing it and making all these particles that they started to feed on smaller and smaller and smaller. So that pile's starting to go down. You can't recognize the original material because it's been broken down so much by the bacteria and the microbes in that pile. It's got a nice, rich, dark color. It should smell earthy, not like ammonia. It should not smell like ammonia. That means it's really raw. And it should not smell like rotten eggs because that means it went anaerobic. That means your lack of oxygen has created anaerobes that produce this sulfur smell to it. Stability is the measure of the activity of the compost. You can tell that by the compost analysis through the seal testing assurance tests that are done. The activity will have diminished, and they will tell you whether it's stable, moderately stable, or unstable. And that's typically measured by the amount of CO2 coming off of that compost under laboratory conditions that they test under. Also, maturity is a measure of will it support plant growth. And testing for doneness is done in a lab and in facility tests under very controlled conditions. Next slide. By the way, not all markets require a mature compost. Remember, I mentioned if you want to use it as a mulch, you can lay it on, it'll continue to decompose, but it won't impact negatively the plant root system underneath the mulch. A lot of people think that mulch, when applied to the surface of soil, will rob that soil of nitrogen. It only has an impact if you incorporate it into the soil profile, not if you lay it on the surface. Some excellent research has been done by Dr. Jim Downer of the University of California on this topic out of Ventura County. And I'll be glad to send that to anybody if they would be interested in that research on the fact that soil, even raw wood chips on surface do not rob the nitrogen from the root system of trees and that. So just, that's another myth that I didn't cover, but it's an important one. Next slide. Will the compost grow? So compost maturity, will the compost grow a healthy plant? Remember someone asked, well, I'm doing my own compost. I'm not going to go send it to a lab and spend $100 for a test. I just want to find out, is it ready? Well, you can take, what the labs do is they do this bioassay, usually with cucumber seeds, and they'll tell you based on a blend of the compost in with typically vermiculite, what the seedling emergence is percentage-wise and what the seedling vigor is. Any values above 80%, not 100, it doesn't have to be 100%. If it's 80% for both, then it's indicative of a well-cured compost. So even if your emergence is 100%, but your vigor is maybe a little bit less than 100%, maybe not quite there, it'll still be adequate and can be used as a well-cured compost. It's ready to go. Next. And now we have a little break for some more questions.
Absolutely. And before we go into questions, one quick note going back to the previous slide, because we were talking about, alternatives to lab testing. Just a quick note, if you didn't join us for the last 2 weeks ago webinar and you are a Healthy Soils Program applicant or awardee, that CDFA does require you to send your compost in for last testing, just to at least be able to verify the carbon to nitrogen ratio of the finished compost that you're applying. Just a quick note, I know not everyone here is necessarily involved with Healthy Soils program and is just here for the great knowledge, but want to make sure that we aren't missing out any important details for those of you who are here for the Healthy Soils program benefits. In any case, moving on to our questions. We've had some good ones coming in and some good discussion going on in the chat. Always nice to see. So one is a two-part question, because two folks sent in questions that are kind of tied together. And I'll note that since we are a pretty locally based organization, some of the answers to this question may rely on our very San Diego region specific knowledge, but perhaps we can do a combination of general answering and specific answers for our area. But Craig, the two parts question are, one, where do we find facilities that provide good compost? And building off of that, where locally might people be able to get free compost?
Okay, that second one's a real interesting one, but let's tackle the first one. Okay, the first one, CDFA actually has a link, in particular if you're participating in the Healthy Soils program, that link brings you the CalRecycle website, where they list all of the permitted compost facilities in the state. And you can go to that list, and there'll be an address and a location, and you can then contact the lab, the closest one in your area. The one that's really well known that we use, it's not even in our area, but it's so well known. It's part of because it's part of the STA program, and we're part of the STA program, Seal of Testing Assurance, is the Soil Control Lab or Soil Lab up in Watsonville. That has a long history. It's a very well known, and it is an STA certified lab. Not all the labs are STA certified. That doesn't mean remember you had some options. It doesn't necessarily have to be STA certified. It can be OMRI certified. It can be CDFA organic material input certified. As long as it's got some certification and a lab report that provides you some information on as Kelsey said, the carbon nitrogen ratio, the maturity level. Is it mature? The CDFA Healthy Soils program requires that you use a finished compost, which is, i.e., mature, meaning it'll grow a plant. It can't be raw. It can't be so green that you smell ammonia come on out of it. So that's the answer to the first question. The second question is, where can you get free compost? There is a program, I'm not going to get into too detail on it, called the SB 1383 Short-Lived Climate Pollutant Act, that is going to be mandating that every city in the state of California divert organics from landfills and produce good quality compost with that material. And they, as part of that bill, that law that went into effect in January of this year, and the Solano Center would be a fabulous resource to learn more about that topic. The cities will have a procurement requirement that requires them to procure and make available compost. Will it all be free? Maybe, maybe not. It depends on, I think, the budget of the cities, depends on a lot of things. The distance, maybe it'll require that the compost is free, but the transportation to get it to your site or to your location, maybe you have to go pick it up. There's a lot of unanswered questions right now on that, but there's certainly a lot of information online through CalRecycle and through the Solano Center on that Senate Bill 1383, the Short-Lived Climate Pollutant Act, that is all designed to take and divert organics producing methane in landfills and use them for more beneficial uses. It just kicked in January. We're only into month 3 of it, and it's going to be with us for a long time, and it's going to change the way we look and view and use compost. So I would say that's one to watch. Find out what the cities are going to be doing to provide that. Also, community gardens, you may find neighbors that want to do composting. The University of California, when I was affiliated with them up in Santa Clara, we had the master composting program that was picked up by the county of Santa Clara. that taught people and provided composting so people could produce their own compost. Solano Center teaches how to do on-farm composting to utilize your own recycled organics. So there's a lot of
We have a course
resources.
starting this Saturday if you're interested.
So in that case, it requires some sweat equity on your part, but obviously the price is right if you make your own. I hope that answered that question.
Yeah, absolutely. And to add to that, I'm so glad you brought up SB 1383, Craig, because I was going to mention a few options that I know locally because they're ahead of the curve on, helping get the great word and product of compost out there. But that is definitely something that is new in our landscape here in California that I think is going to be bringing so many awesome changes in, both making organic waste diversion and the finished product, this awesome compost, more available to folks. I will add to that. I know that, not necessarily in farm portions, probably more applicable to those who are looking for compost for home gardens. I believe that San Pasqual Valley Soils has like a free compost day on a monthly basis.
I forgot to mention it, actually. Yes.
I was like, I
Once a
wonder if he's
month.
trying to keep it secret.
I know. I'm glad you reminded me. Once a month, the second Saturday of the month, San Pasqual Valley Soils in Escondido offers one of our composted products for free up to two cubic yards, a pickup truck load. You can load it for free, or we'll load it for you for $10, and you just drive up, we'll load you, and away you go. And it's there to encourage people to use compost more, to get familiar with using compost, to get familiar with the different types of compost. We have composted mulches, we have manure compost, we have landscape compost, we have a combination of mulch and compost. So there's a lot. Remember, I talked about particle size, and not all compost is created equal. So we have a number of options, and we're trying to get that information out to people. So we offer second Saturday, 7 a.m. for those in the San Diego area till 1:30. Stop on by. It'll be March 12th of this month. And we're offering our composted growers mulch and also some wood chips that we ground for those that just want a more landscape look of just raw wood chips for their home orchard or their landscape plants. But that's every second Saturday of the month. Yep.
I love with all the awesome things that San Pasqual Valley Soils is doing that they offer, one great thing to give back to the community. I'll add that again, on a smaller home garden scale, we both Craig and Solana Center work with a facility in Ramona that composts horse manure, and they're sometimes happy to give it away for free as well. If you're interested, please feel free to send me an email at compost@solanacenter.org, and I'll try to hook you up that way.
I should mention, by the way, we do offer our raw cow manure at no cost, except we charge $20 to load any size vehicle you bring to us. We'll give you all the raw cow manure that you can carry, that you can make your own compost with. Not a bad deal if you want to do the work and you have the room.
Definitely good to know.
Yeah.
We are at 7:05. You know how long it'll take to cover the rest of our content. Do you think we have time for one more question, or should we keep moving along?
Let's move on and let's see if we can hold them to the end there. I'm going to try to move through the next slides pretty quickly. A lot of pictures here. Not a lot of detail. I've covered a lot of the details, so we'll move through them, and hope I'll leave I'd like to leave about 15 minutes for questions at the end.
Beautiful. Yeah, then thank you folks for holding on your outstanding questions. We'll get through the rest of our slides and come back to those shortly. Carry us away once again, Craig.
Thank you. Next. Okay. Compost applications. Big subject. It's one thing to compost or purchase compost, but then how do you get it to your site and how do you apply it? So what you are trying to accomplish with the use of your compost actually determines the type of equipment and method of application. Particle size of compost can be critical. There are equipment that can handle one size and not other sizes. Are you going to soil incorporate the material? Do you need soil incorporation equipment? Are you going to do a seed top dressing? Will that top dressing be too thick? I mean, does the equipment put it out too fast and not slow enough for you to manage it? There are all kinds of variables that you have to address when you talk about applying compost. Side dressing for row crops, orchard. You're going to use it obviously in orchards. You're not going to want to soil incorporate. You're not going to want to tear unless you're just planting an orchard, then you can soil incorporate it. But once is it an established orchard or is it a new orchard? Or are you going to create a mulched bed around and underneath the trees and the, let's say vines, grapevines? Compost berms. You can use compost for filtering runoff, and you can create a berm with it. And there's equipment actually for doing that, believe it or not. Compost stormwater blankets, we talked about those with the finer material. How are you going to apply all that if you have a large area to cover? And then filter and grow sock applications, something that was introduced back over almost 20 years ago now by Filtrex International out of Ohio. And I worked many years, almost 10 years with that company in the use of socks to move compost around depending on what I was trying to do with it and the different types of compost we used to do different applications. Next. So we're going to go through some of those, but let's take a look first at some of the equipment. There are these blower units. Finn Corporation is the I think the global leader in producing equipment that blows what you would typically call bark blowers or mulch blowers. Here in San Diego, there's a company called Claremont Equipment that actually leases some of this equipment, as well as sells the blower units. They can be attached to the back of a pickup truck, or you can have a self-contained one with a truck mount. You also have manure spreaders that they can provide. Next slide. They come in all shapes and sizes. The blower trucks are just fantastic for blowing fine compost on a slope, particularly if you have, let's say, an acre or 2 acres where it's just going to be a lot of work. They can do it very, very quickly. Most of these larger blower trucks will hold up to 60 cubic yards. That's a lot of material. Some of them as high as 110-yard blowers. Or you can transport it and then load it into these smaller units. They have conveyor systems to load these vehicles or these blower equipment. Next slide. So you have to work with the equipment manufacturers and distributors. The small, nimble ones are really great for smaller applications on farms and on slopes and on orchards and in vineyards. You can get them in, they're more maneuverable. Next slide. And then there's, of course, the old traditional manure spreaders, and there are a lot of different types of manure spreaders. I was surprised when we started applying a lot of that. When I got here to San Pasqual Valley Soils, the dairy has a farming operation. We farm about 350 acres, and I encouraged them to start applying more of our own compost to the fields. And some of it they wanted to apply was fine, and it worked good with one manure spreader, and some of it was more coarse. We had a little bit extra of our composted mulch, and so they had to get a different type of manure spreader just to handle the coarser material. So they come in all shapes and sizes, but they're extremely valuable. And in most cases, farms typically tend to use manure spreaders because they're on level ground in most cases. But this obviously would not work in orchards on slopes like San Diego's avocado industry. Next. Soil incorporation equipment, all kinds of different types. This is one, just your standard discs. That's very common. That's the way we incorporate it. Next slide. But you have more innovative equipment like the spader plow that lifts and drops the soil. This became very popular in Europe. A lot of them are produced in Italy. You see Santa Cruz's agroecology program utilizes a spader plow for soil incorporation, and that's to respect the life in the soil and not pulverize it so much that you damage the mycorrhizal fungi population. It minimizes that damage and thereby allows that soil biology to sustain itself. It basically treats your livestock more gently. Next. How do we create a bigger grower demand for compost? Well, that question, where can you get free compost? That's at the heart of this one. Reduced transportation and application costs are probably the biggest challenge to grower adoption. Even if you can get the material free, how are you going to get it there and how are you going to apply it? That's a real challenge. The benefits of any recycled product must always exceed the cost of delivery and application, or people simply won't adopt it. And that's a big problem that we have to solve. It's going to be one of the biggest challenges with Senate Bill 1383, as more and more people are encouraged to adopt these practices. And now how do we get that material there? Next. No-till drills and planters. Another no-till farming is becoming more and more popular. There are many scales. You can do it on a very small scale, or in this case, a very large scale. In the Midwest, it's become very, very popular. And again, it's to minimize the amount of soil disturbance and allow that soil biology to thrive without too much damage. Next. Recycled carbon in the form of composted filter media. This is that large, coarser 2 to 3 inch material, 1 to 2 to 3 inches. About 60% of it will be in that size range, and then 40% or less will be a 3/8 inch or so. And it's designed to optimize the flow of water through the media, thereby optimizing filtration and the removal of contaminants and sediment. Next. So we're going to go through the next slides pretty fast. I'm going to show you a case study in Temecula, California, where that slope and a lot of growers are faced with a large amount of water that's removing a lot of their topsoil, and that's what happened at this site. And unfortunately, two young boys were playing alongside that cutaway slope, and it actually collapsed on them, and one of them lost his life. It really brought home the importance of controlling your soil erosion and restoring and fixing these problems. Next. So the community got together with the HOA, the city of Temecula, the Army Corps of Engineers, NRCS, and they adopted a compost-based approach by filling socks filled with growing media and seed. Next. Laid it on the edges after they graded it, and then they put a coarse combination of fine and coarse compost on the slopes that was all hand applied in this case. Next, they put live stakes. They drove them right through the socks. This is what it looked like after they applied the compost, and the compost grow socks along the edges to stabilize that and anchored it in to the edges of the slope. Next. And this is what it looked like after the vegetation established, securing that slope. You can see before on the right side of the slide and after with the vegetation. Next slide is a close-up of that vegetation and how well it did at stabilizing that and creating habitat and minimizing the amount of erosion and stopping the problem. And so the sock mesh actually stabilizes it. You anchor in that vegetation right on the edges where it's going to counter a lot of shear stress from the flowing water. And during a storm event, this stream will definitely flow and be filled with water, and that's why you want that stability. Next. Here it is, socks filled, not with growing media, but with filter media, just to stop a flow of sediment, 3 feet of sediment going into, in this case, an apartment complex. In a pyramid fashion, they call it a pyramid stack, works extremely well for quick, easy sediment trapping and protection of property and stopping of that movement of that soil away from where it's being released. Next. Here is a fire site. Compost socks can be used to filter the runoff from fires. Next. And the head of the Cal Recycle's large-scale post-fire remediation chief, Todd Thalheimer, when he worked on the Paradise Fire, said he worked with a lot of fire remediation projects and claimed that the only erosion sediment control product worth a darn on the market in these extreme conditions were compost socks, and he planned to use nothing but it. He used over 1 million linear feet in the Paradise Fire in Chico to clean up those sites after a fire. Very, very effective filtering devices. Next. A lot of people use straw wattles. Next. Unfortunately, they actually increase turbidity going into an inlet because of the nature of the turbulence of the water flowing into a device that doesn't filter. Straw blocks, it doesn't filter. It has its place. It's not a filtering device. Next. This is from their test by SWR Environmental. They did their own studies, and as they said, compacted straw does not filter, it repels water. Next. You're much better off. They published, and in the resource guide, there will be a link to getting information on that work with straw bottles by Southwest Environmental. US EPA, what do they think about compost filter socks? Next. Filtrex inlet socks have a greater surface area. This came from the EPA when they first introduced these socks. With contact with, have better contact with soil and road surfaces. They can be used on impervious surfaces to filter out sediment and reduce contaminants in the water runoff and the water quality of our receiving streams. Next, and lakes and rivers. The microorganisms in the compost also have the ability to degrade organic contaminants. They can be left on site after construction, and you remove the mesh and you can seed right into it. It's really a brilliant innovation in the use of compost to improve water quality and protect it. Next. Here is on a fire site, the Lilac Fire in San Diego, where I applied this by hand. I just laid the filter socks on the top and the bottom, and in the middle to slow the flow down, and then threw a layer of compost, fine compost, half-inch compost as a blanket with some wildflower seeds. Next. And this is what it looked like 6 months later after the rains came in. It wasn't much of a layer, but that layer of compost held that water, allowed the wildflowers to germinate. Next. And it worked beautifully. And as a mulch, composted wood chips demonstrated the slowest spread of 8 mulch treatments, and we're going to include that in the resource guide, of any mulch treatment. That included raw wood chips, included wood chips that have been treated with a fire retardant. The composted wood chips only smoldered with very occasional flaming, and the flame height was low. It was just an extremely effective mulch for suppressing fire around buildings and landscapes, something a lot of people are not aware of. Next. So I'm sharing this with you just to give you an idea of all the different uses. Now we're just going to wrap up with just a pitch for becoming practitioners of healthy soils. What I'm sharing with you today is just the tip of the iceberg on what there is to know. And the survival of all living creatures, including ourselves, depend on the care of 11% of the Earth's surface of arable land. And if we make ourselves, if we avail ourselves of these resources of organic materials like compost that exist, and teach ourselves to be practitioners of healthy soils through the creation and use of compost, we actively participate in sustaining all life on this planet, especially the microscopic livestock that exists beneath our soil, and increases the ecosystem benefits they provide us. Next. The compost, just real quick, these are on the resource guide. I'm just going to go through real fast. There's the compost and mulch use toolbox on CalRecycle, phenomenal resource with tons of information. You can mine that website all day long and not exhaust it. There's so much information on it. Please check it out. Next. Dr. David Crone of UC Riverside did a phenomenal research report for 2 years on compost best management practice for remediating soils, particularly soils that had been exposed to a wildfire. This report is available on the resource guide. Phenomenal research and irrefutable evidence of the effectiveness of compost blankets in this particular case on filtering contaminants and helping restore fire damaged soils. Next. As well as regular soils for that matter. The Sustainable Site Design Manual from Forester Press is a tool that has 24 different applications for managing the landscape and creating green infrastructure and low impact development for stormwater management and soil health. It's just a phenomenal resource. Check it out. Next. We can and need to do better. Wherever possible, we absolutely need to mimic nature. Next. The closer we manage the landscapes to their natural design, the more we save on energy, input, hard infrastructure, and financial expenditures. Working with nature actually takes advantages of the services that are both free and efficient due to these natural resources like compost. Next. Nature doesn't recognize the human concept of waste. When we recycle, compost, and repurpose our natural organic resources, we are participating and cooperating with nature in the process of restoring and protecting our planet. Next. These are some of the additional resources available through Solana Center's HSP page. Check it out afterwards. I know Kelsey has a lot more to say on that. Next.
And the last slide is our very final one. That's just a thank you slide.
Okay.
So before we head on to that, yes, I'll be sending out a follow-up email either tomorrow or the day after with additional resources related to Healthy Soils program and the topics we've discussed today. If you're local, we would love for you to join us for our on-farm composting course that starts this weekend. We still have a couple spots remaining. We do also do, for a smaller scale, a master composter course that we would love to have you join us for. And of course, this is the second part in a 3-part series, all about the Healthy Soils program and making and using compost. So we have one more coming up in 2 weeks. And I also put this wonderful worm friend here to help remind me to launch a quick poll. We greatly appreciate if you all wouldn't mind just taking a couple minutes to answer some quick questions for us. I'm launching it right now. And as a note, there are, let's see, I believe there are 5 questions. So if you don't see a button to submit, you may need to scroll down to get the button that will actually take you to submitting the evaluation. So with that, I'll go ahead and let Dr. Craig wrap us up and we'll head over for some questions. Craig, are you frozen or did you want to say anything else?
Oh, no,
Just making sure I just said sorry.
I had the evaluation in front of my.
Oh, gotcha. No wonder you couldn't
wait
see.
for them to fill it out first.
That'll do it.
Giving them time to complete the survey. So, but no, I just want to thank everybody for just participating in this and hopefully being open to learning things that maybe you didn't know. Like I said earlier, it isn't what we don't know that gets us in trouble. It's what we think we know for certain that just isn't so. And we have so much more to learn. I learn every single day on the job, new things, innovations that growers are doing in the area of no-till farming, market farming in the area. Just absolutely astounds me. I am absolutely so encouraged and hopeful that we are starting to understand our partnership and our marriage to the life of the soil and how absolutely critical it is and what a contribution it is to the quality of our own lives. So I just encourage you to continue to be students and practitioners of healthy soil. And my contact information, if I don't know if I get the poll, maybe there we go, I got it. There's my phone number, my email. You're more than welcome to address any questions I don't answer tonight. If you'd like to send me an email or call me, I'm available. And I'm here as long as people have questions to answer to tonight. So it doesn't have to end at 7:30.
Beautiful. And we do have what I think are some really interesting questions hanging out in the Q&A waiting for us. All right. One good question from Jerome. He asks, any thoughts on zero or no-till with the addition of compost to increase soil organic matter on production farms? And he added, your compost at San Pasqual is excellent.
Oh, good.
So the question was, Dr. Craig, what are your thoughts on you doing no-till and compost together to increase organic matter?
I will share with you again a case where I had a grower come to me. He's been buying our cow manure compost for 4 years, and he said that's just about all we use on our no-till market garden here in Escondido. And I said, God, do you mind if I come out and take a look? And he said, absolutely no problem. Come on anytime, and I'll show you what I'm doing. And he layers about 2 inches of the Valley's Best compost. He really waters it good. He flushes out any salts because manure compost can be salty. And so you've got to make sure you understand that. Fertilizers are salts too. So what you want to do is mellow it out a little bit, but he'll incorporate equal parts of feather meal, alfalfa meal, fish meal, and sea kelp meal. And so equal parts of that, and then 2 inches of the Valley's Best cow manure compost, 2 inches of that. He blends the two together and layers it and then transplants into it. And I was absolutely amazed, not only at the production he was getting and how successful he was, how beautiful his plants looked, but more importantly, the earthworm population underneath the soil was something I had never seen before. It was just teeming. It was as if he had a vermicompost bed there that he was growing all of his vegetables in. The worms came up and fed on that compost with all these other, and most of those additives were for the nitrogen, to increase the nitrogen, to get it a little higher, and some of the other minor nutrients. But that combination was just phenomenal. And I can't speak more highly of what I've seen with no-till gardening for at least vegetable production, and for his avocados and citrus, and all of his fruit trees also were extremely healthy looking.
And Craig, if I recall,
loaded with earthworms.
and if I recall, he also commented on how good the carrots tasted.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, the quality of his produce. I don't have his permission to share the name of the company, his farm, but it was amazing. I was astounded by the success of his no-till approach, and it was something that was new to me.
Nice. Yeah, and that is definitely one of the other practices that Healthy Soils program is invested in, gearing farmers toward to help preserve soil organic matter.
He was featured in a book called The Living Soil Handbook by Jess Frost. I will share that with you because this grower in Escondido was featured in this book, and it is available. And I bought it so I could learn. Again, I'm learning every day about how he had accomplished what he had done, because I was so impressed with it. So there are some excellent publications on no-till farming. This one's entitled The Living Soil Handbook by Jess Frost. It's just one of a number that are available now.
And just because it's connected to the answer to that question, one of our attendees asked if that recipe for no-till can be typed into the chat. Jean, to reply, I probably won't have a chance to put it in the chat while we continue with the webinar, but I'll follow up with Craig and try to get that included in the follow-up email. So keep an eye out for that. Alrighty, continuing on with our questions. This one might be kind of like region specific because it's specifically asking about one of San Pasquale Valley Soils products, but I think that some of your answer could probably be applied to other folks that have similar soils. Luis is asking, what would you recommend for adding to San Pasquale Valley Soils raised bed mix and adding to my Valley Center decomposed granite?
If you want to stay organic, I would go with the feather meal, which is a 12% 0.0. You have plenty of phosphorus and potassium in the raised garden bed mix because it's 60% compost. It's about 50% landscape compost, 10% cow manure compost. There's cocoa coir in there, 10%. Some sand, washed sand, to give it a little bit more bulk density to hold some of the taller plants like corn in that, if you want. And then we have also pumice in there at about 15% to open up and get that oxygen, that 25% air that we want in there. So it's an excellent base, but it needs nitrogen. So if you're wedded to an organic approach, a feather meal is an excellent slow release source. However, if you're a combination of conventional and organic, something like ammonium sulfate at 21%, very small amounts of it work very well. Just make sure that if you're using ammonium sulfate, that after you apply it to the soil before you plant, you water it and let that set for a while and let the microbes start to activate and feed off the nitrogen, because the mineralization in the soil that occurs when you add something like a synthetic nitrogen like ammonium sulfate converts that to nitrate through biological activity. So you want to give that soil a little opportunity to go ahead and start to convert that ammoniacal form of nitrogen into nitrate nitrogen. You do that and you'll have a very, very successful garden.
So cool. Ooh, all right. One other that I think is really interesting. One of our attendees is wondering, what do you think of compost made from sewage sludge?
Biosolids, it's interesting. Um, that's a real interesting question because for thousands of years, I still remember in graduate school, I had a colleague who was from Hawaii. He was Japanese, and in Hawaii, they used their own human compost to grow all their crops. They called it, I think it had a night something. I can't remember the exact name, but
Night soils.
night soils. And so in
Sure.
China has used human waste, not even as treated as much as ours. But here's what's changed. Here's what's made it a little bit of a difficult question to answer. For horticultural crops that you're not eating, I say you're fine, you're safe in that. But for food crops, one of the things that we expel now through our digestive system and excretory system are pharmaceuticals, are things that we take in, and we still don't have a good handle and we're not really testing for them either. There are so many pharmaceuticals that people consume that are excreted through our digestive system that go into biosolids. And that's not to say that I have used biosolids and they work extremely well, both in vegetable beds and as a fertilizer for lawns, for ornamentals, for tree crops, things that the soil, I just don't know what's happening with a lot of these metabolites that we're excreting and whether they're being taken up by plants and whether that's going to be an issue. I think it's going to be a real active area of research because we do need to use that material in some fashion. And right now it does go primarily to agriculture, but to agriculture where the produce does not touch the soil that's been treated with the biosolids. So vines, grapes, tree crops, ornamentals, all of those types of crops are a great target, if you will, for the use of biosolids. Again, I only raised the question of some of these other pharmaceuticals that are coming out only because I just don't think we know. It's just a big question mark in my mind.
And their impacts are felt at parts per billion.
In parts per trillion, actually, believe it or not. Yeah.
Wow.
So I just don't know. I have to, this is one of those areas where I literally don't know what the long-term effects are going to be.
And potentially no one fully knows. It
Not
is
right
under
now, they
active
don't.
investigation.
We have to look at this, so we really do.
Yeah, it's
And
definitely a catch-22 because you
I
don't
will-
want to use, sorry, go ahead, Craig.
I will say that the carbon content in biosolids, as well as landscape compost and food waste compost, really binds a lot of these toxins, really ties them up so the plant can't get at them. So I think I'm encouraged by the fact that that may be the case. I just don't have any proof of it. But for the lack of proof, one thing we do know is that carbon really holds on to these chemicals and these toxins and does not release them. So I think that's in our favor in this case.
Yeah, it's definitely a catch-22 because, there is so much good in our excrement in terms of the organic material and the nutrients that we lose when those things pass through our systems, but we certainly don't want to underestimate the potential concerns that could come with it because of all the other things we consume too.
Right.
All right, another question here from Joyce. She's wondering, what do you think about compost tea? Is it worth the effort of producing it?
Some real interesting studies on that, or commentaries on it. One of the gentlemen, Robert Pavlis, he publishes a garden myths blog and website. He's a chemist. I think that the jury is still out. I mean, he will say that if you give the microbes in the soil the food they're looking for, the effect of a compost tea will be insignificant or very minimal. However, a lot of times the soil that we have, it's kind of like it's depleted already, and it's going to take, as we found out from compost, it takes time for that soil and that compost to mature and mellow out and reap all the rewards of the stored nutrients. So my personal feeling is it's beneficial because it's it's a big shot of all those microbes immediately, and I don't have to worry about whether I have the right ratio of the feedstock in there in terms of compost to increase the population of those microbes. You know, so because that compost tea is going to be loaded with microbes, so you're putting a lot in. I think if you continue to feed compost over time, I think I have no evidence of this, but I think compost tea will have less and less of a beneficial effect as the soil microbes eat that organic material and release those nutrients into the soil. But initially, when you're getting started, I think there's some real added advantages to a compost tea.
And this
Craig-
is getting in the weeds, but of course you're moving from a compost biome ultimately to a soil biome.
Yeah.
And so it's all going to go toward increasing your soil biome ultimately. So like you said, it can be additive compost or a punch of tea, but I think you're still it's gonna stabilize at some point.
Yeah, at some point. There's so much activity going on. It's just hard. It's hard to evaluate, to be honest. It's hard to study some of these questions, to be perfectly frank, because the complexity of the system is so great.
Absolutely. Craig, what was the name of that blog you referenced again that had some information?
It's called Garden Myths or Gardening Myths by Robert Pavlis, Pavlis. Robert Pavlis, Garden Myths. And he's certainly in favor of organics. He just likes to base what we conclude on good science. And he's a chemist by training, and I think he does a good job. I think he's worth listening to. He makes you look at things differently.
And I know that as part of our Master Composter course, we often share this compost tea task force document that I know Diane knows what I'm referencing. Perhaps I will add that to our resource list and send that out in the follow-up email as well, just in case anyone's interested in seeing some research that's been done to that end. All right, it looks like we have one more question, unless anyone else gets something firing in their brain. And this one is interesting. I'm not sure that we'll necessarily have an answer for it because I think it is ongoing, but I'll put it out there in case Craig or Diane, either of you have thoughts on it. The question is, with SB 1383 and presumably this increased composting of our organic materials throughout the state of California, how will issues with PFAS be minimized? And for those that want any background knowledge, PFAS are a class of chemicals that are widely used in different commercial products. They are very, very long lasting, very resistant to decomposing, and they have been shown to have some harmful health effects for humans and other living creatures. So I'm not sure, Craig or Diane, if you have anything to add to this end, but
I will add one comment because I'm working with some people in the biochar industry, and they claim that, first of all, biochar is another one of these terms like compost that covers a wide area, meaning not all biochar is created equal, and you have to evaluate your biochar for the percent ash and carbon and just the way it was processed. But with that said, good quality biochar that's been well analyzed and that apparently will tie up some of that PFAS, that you can add it to your compost and your soils and tie, again, it's that strong binding capability of carbon. And with biochar, you're enhancing even more of that, those exchange sites that will grab a hold of these compounds. And even though the PFAS is there, it doesn't go anywhere. I mean, literally when I worked in agriculture, one of the things that they taught us when we were around pesticides, if you were ever exposed to pesticides, you were to take activated charcoal in water and drink it, because it would grab a hold of the pesticide that you had consumed and you would excrete it without doing damage to your internal organs. I mean, that shows you just how unbelievably powerful carbon is in our environment. And that's just one I've heard. They seem to feel very confident that research will be confirmed and verified. And so there's hope, always hope when it comes to carbon, I think.
I think biochar is even more mythical than compost. And I worked for a vet in college, and we used activated charcoal as a treatment when animals, ate poisons, ingested poisons, snail bait, and things like that. So that is a very common treatment, actually. The only thing I would say on that, on the PFAS, is I think from what I've heard is it's showing up everywhere. It's showing in the waterways. It's in our bloodstream. It's in our breast milk. It's everywhere. That I think that the target will be to get it out of our waste stream. It's really trying to go more actively we're not trying to figure a way to how to combat it. It doesn't come out in the composting process typically. And rather than trying to fight it downstream is to fight the battle upstream is what I've heard.
Source control. Yeah,
Yep.
where's it coming from, and control the source of it.
Yeah.
And that's definitely going to be one of the big challenges overall with SB 1383 is figuring out how we only have the things that we want in our compost, whether as opposed to the things we don't want, whether those things be PFAS, plastics, other things that don't break down, pesticides, etc. It is an ongoing thing, most definitely.
Yep, defining quality of compost is going to be critical. And I will end by just saying, you can't manage something that you can't measure.
Right.
Measuring the quality of compost is going to be critical to the adoption and the use and the benefits that we derive from it.
Yeah.
Most definitely. Well, glimmers of hope in what was almost ending on a sad note. But in any case, thank you again so much for joining us tonight, Dr. Craig, and sharing all of your knowledge. Thank you to our folks who have joined us for sending in such great questions and the great discussion that happened in the chat. We will be joining again in another 2 weeks with another local expert who is Josh Robinson, who is going to talk more with us about incorporating compost and other perennial and different plantings to both improve the quality of your soil, and another focus of Dr. Craig's being able to conserve and make the best of water on your property. So join us then. Keep an eye out in the next day or two for that follow-up email coming your way with additional resources. And we look forward to seeing you all again soon. Reach out to us if you have any questions.
Craig, thank you so much. This was an excellent presentation. I always learn something every time you talk, so I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
You're very welcome, and my pleasure, always. Take care.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Have a great night.
Bye, all.